This course is sponsored by the National Hospice and Palliative Care Organization. We'd like to thank the National Hospice and Palliative Care Organization for their generosity in making this course possible.
As for all of us, birth brings new life. With each new life comes a journey, often with critically important experiences at the end of life, which can be enhanced through skilled volunteers. Hello, I'm Dr. Scott Shreve, the National Hospice and Palliative Care Program Director for the Department of Veterans Affairs. Welcome to the second volunteer training course of the No Veteran Dies Alone program. The purpose of this course is to help you identify your feelings about serious illness, dying, and grief. Discuss 3 things that play a big role in veterans' illness and dying process. Provide an overview of the grief process. And finally, offer tips from other volunteers that will hopefully help you. As we learned in the first volunteer training course, being with someone at the end of life is a gift to both. Building a relationship and supporting a veteran facing serious illness is a sacred act. However, to become a No Veteran Dies Alone volunteer, you must be willing to look at your own feelings and perceptions about serious illness and the dying process in order to honor others facing this situation. To prepare yourself, think about these questions. What is your experience with dying and loss? What feelings, positive or negative, do these experiences bring up for you? Have you had a loss in the past year? For example, a parent, spouse, or sibling? And what was your response? Do you see grief as normal or necessary? What are the customs about death and grief in your culture or family? You may want to pause this video for a few minutes to write down your answers to these questions. Also, take time to discuss these questions with your volunteer coordinator, family, friends, and others who can provide helpful support. It is important that you are aware of your own responses and reactions to illness, dying, and grief, so you can be fully present to be supportive for each veteran that you are sitting with along his or her journey. Next, I want to discuss 3 things that play a huge role for veterans facing serious illness that you need to be aware of as a volunteer. And these are the effects of a veteran's military culture, the veteran's own culture and practices, and the veteran's spiritual or religious beliefs. You will not be an expert on these 3 points I just mentioned, but I want you to have some preparation for these issues as part of your orientation. Ultimately, your ability to listen and remain culturally sensitive is the most critical skill you will bring as a volunteer. Military culture is constantly evolving, and a veteran's military experience will depend on the era and events surrounding their service. For example, World War II veterans experienced a different military culture than Korean, Vietnam, Persian Gulf, or Afghanistan veterans. Military culture shapes those who serve, often in positive ways, and their service can influence how veterans cope with serious illness and approach end of life. Military culture can also impact the way veterans communicate. Some veterans don't talk about their feelings openly. Remember, for many veterans, their military training did not encourage them to show emotion. So it may be difficult for some veterans to say things such as, "Please forgive me," "I forgive you," "Thank you," and "I love you." Just remember, we often cannot change a lifetime of behavior, but we can be a presence and a companion on this final leg of their journey.
It's the fact that we're veterans, there's those common experiences you had in the service, and you have that immediate connection that just builds that relationship with your patient and the hospice volunteer.
A veteran's own cultural background can affect and determine their many thoughts on illness, dying, and grief. It can shape and determine his or her preferences about care, such as how much the veteran wants to be told about his or her illness, who provides care, and how this end-of-life care will be delivered. Cultural practices also have a role in dying. Some cultures believe that one must have a quiet and peaceful place to die. Behaviors such as wailing and crying in the room would not be appropriate. Other cultures do not believe in speaking about death. They believe that talking about it will make it happen. Regardless of the veteran's background, it is okay to ask, what is important to you when talking with a veteran about making the most of the time they have left. It is important for volunteers as well as the healthcare team to respect and honor a veteran's culture and learn to be culturally sensitive so that veterans can feel supported, physically, emotionally, and spiritually. Asking open-ended questions when talking with veterans and showing a willingness to learn about their culture can provide important and personalized support during a veteran's difficult time. The veteran's spiritual and religious beliefs can play an important role in coping and finding meaning along the trajectory of serious illness. Some veterans say, "I'm dying, I'm ready when the time comes for me to die." Their certainty may give them a sense of peace. Others may voice uncertainty as they approach death about what happens next. Some wonder where they will go after they die. Sometimes veterans become fearful when recalling their actions during war. Some are afraid that they cannot be forgiven. Uncertainty can cause fear and stress. It's important to be authentic when you're with a veteran because they will know if you are speaking from the heart. Volunteers should not try to give veterans the answers to their spiritual or religious questions. The seriously ill veteran is often trying to pull these pieces together, and the question may be more important than the answer. Your primary job as a volunteer is to be present with the veteran, as this presence of self is among the most valuable gifts we can share. If you believe a veteran is in need of emotional, spiritual, or religious support, communicate this need to the healthcare team, including the volunteer coordinator. Lastly, I'd like to briefly discuss the grief process. Grief is a natural response to facing illness and dying and the death of a loved one. Grief is the pain experienced with a loss, and the grieving process is different for each person. The pain from grief could be physical, for example, loss of appetite, sleep, or heartache, as well as emotional. Grief affects the veterans who are dying, impacts the veteran's family before and after the death of a veteran, and may leave a mark on you as a volunteer. When experiencing grief, it is common for people to have a hard time concentrating, to feel sad or depressed, to be angry or frustrated, or to feel misunderstood, anxious, nervous, or fearful. Some people may feel like they want to escape. Others may find themselves feeling guilt, remorse, or ambivalence. Some may experience numbness or a lack of feeling or energy. Grief is not a predictable process and can be experienced in cycles. Someone in grief may feel like they are going in circles when in reality they are making progress. Cultural background can also affect how people approach the grief process. In many cultures, rituals and ceremonies acknowledge the pain of the loss while also offering social support and a reaffirmation of life. People are often not aware of how their own cultural background affects the grieving process. As a volunteer, I advise you to be patient with the grieving process and allow the veteran, their family, and friends to share the full spectrum of emotions and permit the grief process to take its course. It is vitally important for you as a volunteer to pay attention to your own grief and take time for your own self-care. At times, you may need to speak with the volunteer coordinator about your experience to address your own feelings of loss. In taking care of yourself, it helps you to better serve the veterans you support in your volunteer work. Here are some tips from veterans who work with seriously ill and dying veterans that may provide some helpful guidance in your volunteer role.
The reason I think this is so important for veterans to be involved is that it's the old common bond thing. You can have you can volunteer for someone and you can be very successful at it, but it always adds an extra layer to the thing if you have some kind of a common bond. And military people, whether I'm Navy or someone else, we just interviewed this fellow who is Army, we still have the bond of service and loyalty and honor and those sorts of things. And to be able to come in as a healthy volunteer and to bring that amount of camaraderie to someone who is ill, I think is extremely important. And everyone that I've encountered who has been involved in that program has just felt so gratified by it.
And there was one veteran, John, who I was his patient companion for. He was on service and then he went off and then he came back on. When he came back on, he asked for the volunteer Mike to be his volunteer again. He enriched my life. I'll always remember John, and I think I enriched his life at the end, added meaning to his life. He was not alone. He had a friend that he could do things with. And being a veteran, we did typical veteran things and talked typical veteran talk, and it was wonderful. And I'll miss John always, and I think it was a special relationship, and I would not have had it if I was not a volunteer with Elizabeth Hospice.
We covered a lot in this course, so let's recap. We've talked about the importance of exploring, identifying, and expressing your own feelings about illness, dying, and grief as part of the volunteer training process. Being aware of how culture, including military culture, can impact a veteran at the end of their life. And remember how important supporting a veteran's spiritual or religious beliefs can be for someone facing serious illness, but that religious or spiritual counseling should be handled by a trained clergy or religious leader. Acknowledging the grief process and how important it is to take care of yourself as a volunteer. And you heard from other volunteers sharing their tips on what works for them. In closing, your role as a volunteer provides vital support through your presence along the journey of a veteran's life, especially at the end of life. On behalf of the Department of Veterans Affairs, we thank you for taking the time to enrich your volunteerism through deepening your understanding, compassion, and respect for what veterans and their families face during illness, dying, and grief. Your service as a volunteer deeply impacts the veteran and their family and is often remembered as a priceless gift of love and compassion.
If you have any questions or need assistance, go to the PsychArmor website or call the PsychArmor support line at 844-779-2427. Thank you for completing this course and taking that one step further in learning about our American veterans.